Hello and welcome back to the Exist Better YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the collective liberal shadow and the collective conservative shadow. So we're going to break each of these down and kind of explain what's really going on underneath the surface of each of these patterns, and we're basically going to come to discover how they are actually a mirror, believe it or not, of each other. So before I launch into this, there's a few things I need to say. One, if you heavily identify as super conservative or super liberal or super political in general, all of this might offend you, so feel free to not watch this if you feel like this is just going to put you in a bad mood. With that said, I'm going to be super fair, and I'm going to talk about very much the pros and cons of, not the pros and cons, but how each side is correct. And then we're going to talk about what is unconscious on each side, so how each side is missing something. If you don't believe what this theory is rooted in, you're not going to believe anything I have to say. So this theory is rooted in Jungian psychology, and that is a fancy way of saying that we have a conscious mind that we're very familiar with, a subconscious mind that we are not very familiar with, and to become conscious of those subconscious aspects takes work. We call that integration work. And in addition, there can be individual shadows, so you have a shadow, but there's also what we call the collective shadow, where groups of people all have the same shadow. So in the Western world, most of us basically assume that liberals and conservatives don't agree on anything. They have all the opposite opinions about what would make society function better. They have totally opposing ideologies, and there's no overlap there whatsoever. And most people think that one of them is very right and one of them is very wrong. And it's, as you know, has grown into this point of contention and pure hatred, and to the point where it has become very obvious that this is not about politics, this is about trauma. Anyone who is skeptical of that, just tune into any recent, over the past several years, political news, political debate. You'll notice it has descended far and far away from debate and toward things like ridicule, name calling, violence, violent protests. These two groups literally fighting each other, calling each other names on the internet, writing articles to shame one another. And this even goes all the way up to the level of, presidential debates will be actually engaging in this. So you can see how political debate gets further and further obscured, and we keep moving further and further away from it, because what we're actually moving toward is the actual trauma points that each of these groups are acting from. Okay, so first, let's just look at the conscious aspects. What do we actually know consciously about each of these groups? So, starting with conservatism. What is conservatism when you really boil it down? Conservatives value tradition. They tend to be, again, these are tendencies. They tend to be big on emphasizing work ethic, family values, tight-knit families, providing for your family, yourself and your family unit. So a bit of like an every man for himself thing, like I take care of myself and my family, and that is my responsibility. So personal responsibility is another big thing, and we're going to talk more about that. Liberalism. When we boil down liberalism, what really makes a person liberal? So, one, progressive values. So liberals are looking forward, whereas conservatives, in the nature of to conserve, is to kind of look back. like, this valuing tradition structure. So liberals are doing the exact opposite. They're looking forward to see where can things go. Whereas conservatism is all about myself and my family, the family unit. Liberalism is again the opposite. It's all about building wider communities. How do I fit in my community? How can I serve my community? It's taking a more global perspective about what's happening in societies at large, as opposed to what's happening in my immediate community. So a liberal would strongly deny that we only have to take responsibility for ourselves and our immediate families. A liberal would say something along the lines of, we're all in this together, we all have to contribute, we all deserve a piece of the pie. So it's very, very communal. Sharing, as opposed to, it's not really emphasizing work ethic like conservatism. It's emphasizing sort of like human dignity, like everyone deserves just because they deserve. And this is something that, again, these are all big, big points of contention, because liberals will say, talk a lot about inequality and how humans being humans deserve, food, shelter, like whatever, labor, like that sort of thing. There's just this mentality of we all deserve to have the same amount, in a sense. Conservatives will get very upset with that because they're very rooted in this work ethic thing. So it's like everything's merit based with the conservative. It's like, what did you earn? As I'm laying these out, you're gonna probably start to immediately identify which one of these makes more sense to you just on the surface level. You can start to see how they consciously are direct opposites, right? They value directly opposite things. Therefore, this is where it gets interesting. They have directly opposite things in their shadow, and each have good reason for this. So let's start with the conservative shadow here. So conservatives, on average, if I'm correct, they tend to skew older, less college education, and more, like sort of working class. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to be more college educated, possibly even more wealth. I'm not sure about that, but more education, and they skew younger. When we look at the sets of values, we have to take into account that parenting was drastically different for these two types of groups. Now, I'm not going to go into this. I'm going to do a whole other video on this, but the difference between how baby boomers were raised and how millennials were raised is, in my opinion, a big part of the contention, because again, they were basically raised with directly opposite sets of parenting was so radically different. It was basically opposite, from between those two generations. So let's just get into conservatives first. Now, even regardless of what age you are, if you strongly identify as conservative, there's going to be a tendency for you to grow up in a certain type of family that holds a certain type of values. All those things I just talked about, the ideology. Now, in conservative upbringings, from what I've observed, there is a strong tendency towards suppression that isn't quite there usually in the liberal upbringing. So there's this element of, and when I say suppression, I mean suppression of emotion. And again, going back to the idea that conservatives skew older, they tend to be in older generations, not so much millennials and younger. They tended to grow up in these households where suppression was very, very integral. So like getting away from negative emotions and stuffing them down was the way to deal with it. So it was so suppression of emotion was a survival strategy. So the conservative learns that the way to have a successful life and to be a respectable person is to not engage or identify with any personal trauma and suppress it and put it aside for the sake of getting your duties and obligations done. Basically, being a role model citizen and doing what you are supposed to do. Conservatives talk about their big thing is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Like it does not matter if you are disadvantaged. Everything is your responsibility and you cannot put that on anyone else. Now, this is what they use for empowerment. And like I said, for a conservative who's had a very difficult life, particularly a really difficult childhood, this was how they survived. This was quite literally a survival technique that they used, that their nervous system ingrained into them. You have to do this to stay alive. So, am I saying conservatism is a trauma response? To some extent, yes. Now, when I say they use this personal responsibility, take responsibility for yourself mentality to empower themselves, they did. Hardcore. So now, whenever you latch onto an ideology really hardcore, there's always going to be that pendulum swing. There's always going to be, okay, then what are you missing? What is your blind spot? And for the conservative, that blind spot is facing the ways in which they were an actual victim, facing all of their feelings about being a victim, facing their negative emotions, facing traumatic experiences, doing things like going to therapy, talking about your feelings. The blind spot of conservative ideology is that vulnerability is not weakness. And because conservatives may have or likely to have grown up in times when vulnerability was absolutely treated as weakness, there's this cognitive dissonance. And it's like, I'm not doing that shit. And if you talk to them, you can get, some of them you'll see get extremely angry, because it's as if you're asking them to give up their survival technique. And they know for a fact, they're like, no, that is not what works. That's not how you survive. It really, what it is victim mentality. They're so uncomfortable with victim mentality that they run from it toward empowerment, but it's not real empowerment because they're not being honest about the ways in which they feel like a victim. So what they're missing, the blind spot, is that you don't have to play the victim in order to acknowledge your trauma. That's the blind spot for the conservatives. Now, here's where it gets funny. Who is doing all of the things that conservatives need to do? It's liberals. Okay? So conservatives hate liberals because they embody their shadow, literally. When a conservative looks at a liberal, what they're experiencing is their own shadow. They have no idea. And so they really think, I hate liberals. They're the worst people in the world. What they're actually experiencing is their hatred of all of the aspects of them that are in shadow. The emotions, the vulnerability, the like relying on other people. Conservatives always get upset with liberals because they rely a lot on, like, they're always talking about scientists and facts. Like, they rely on these outside, whatever you call it, outside people telling them what to do. Conservatives get riled up by every single thing liberals do because it's all of the stuff that's in their shadow that they don't want to identify with. They don't want to be that. And yet it's a part of them because they're human, of course they have emotions and trauma, and they want to wallow and they want to complain about how things aren't fair. They want to do all that, but they hate that in themselves, because that stuff is usually the stuff that made them unsafe as they were growing up. So they won't do it because they're like, no, my parents didn't let me do that, or I did that at school one time and everyone, I got beat up or something. So there's a lot of times there's these really negative experiences around embodying that stuff. This is why especially older conservatives get really mad when liberals get to do all of that and not have negative repercussions, because it's a different time that we live in. And so this is why you'll hear a lot of conservatives complaining about how people are too soft nowadays. That's their big claim to fame. Like really angry conservatives, they're always talking about how people are too soft nowadays. And it's because they're dealing with the pain of basically not being as coddled, as they call it. That's another big word they like to use. Not being as coddled as people are today. Basically, they didn't get to have their wounding and trauma and healing and therapy, and so they shame as a toxic response. They just sort of project this shame at people who are getting recognition and all that stuff, because they still need it too, but they won't admit it because that would be weakness and that would be vulnerable. You get what I'm saying. How you move out of that is, ironically, they would have to become more like liberals. That's what they would have to do to start feeling better. Now, let's get into the liberal shadow. So it's going to be the same story here. Everything that conservatives embody and believe in is in the liberal shadow. Looking at the average modern liberal lifestyle, liberals are all about, education, community, like I said, protecting the environment, standing up for marginalized people is a really big thing in liberalism. So people who didn't, it just hit me just there, it just hit me. Standing up for these marginalized people who didn't historically get the attention and help they deserved. This is another reason conservatives flip shit. It's because liberals are like, look at all these people who didn't get the respect and attention they deserved, and conservatives, they don't even know, I don't even think they even know they're doing this, but they're screaming inside, I didn't get the attention I deserved. That's what that really is. That just hit me. That was so crazy. Like a little like other piece that I didn't even see there. Okay, so anyway. So liberals are always talking about, community, equality, protect the environment, college education is important. A lot of far left people are real big on this idea of the 1%, like 1% has all the wealth, 99% has, the wealth gap is increasing drastically, which it is, so that's a big talking point for them. They're also really into believing listening to authorities, like doctors, scientists. So an interesting thing that happened that kind of clarified the liberal shadow for me was, I actually posted something and someone freaked out and got really mad and started commenting about how I'm a horrible person on Facebook, and basically I have no evidence of this, but according to their profile, they certainly seemed to skew liberal. All of the evidence was there. So, and what I was talking about that made them so angry was me talking about people playing the victim, right? So, it's very easy to have liberal values because it's very like utopian, and it's like, well, why can't we just create everything like in the most awesome way where everyone's happy and everyone gets what they want. Like, it's very easy to see how that might be a good thing. You know, like everyone gets equal everything. So what could possibly be the downside there? You might be, if you're a liberal person, you might be wondering, what could possibly be the downside? Like, we don't have a shadow. Well, you do. And the exact people who are really good at calling that shadow out, are conservatives. The word that I'm going to give to the liberal shadow is going to be codependence. Codependence is something that's really easy to gloss over and avoid, especially when you're decorating it in a very flowery, like utopian way. For example, I personally have noticed how liberals will rely on outside authority, even, supposed, like, they basically have these all-knowing authorities, like science, medicine, research, book smart people. And it's basically like those people are their deities, and it prevents them from having to figure anything out for themselves. So if any of those groups or people or institutions are saying anything that's actually wrong, the liberal would never catch it because it's their dogma, right? This intellectualism and the science and the philosophy and all this intellect, all this mental stuff is actually a lot of times just dogma. It's the same thing as being religious. The liberals' codependence is they act it out politically by talking about how capitalism is the reason for their problems. And I've actually talked to actual liberals who who have said that sentence to me. They've said the reason that I'm having these personal emotional problems is because we live under a corrupt system. And if I would have heard that 5 or 10 years ago, I might have been tempted to say, you're right, because I was caught in it. But when I heard it, 1 or 2 years ago, it blew my mind that these far left, or not, I don't know, just liberal people, they really do believe that something outside of them is controlling them, and things like corruption and inequality, the problems that exist systemically, are directly preventing them from having the life they want to have, from achieving what they want to achieve. And this is codependence at its best. It's saying, I can't change until you change. You being the government, the president, the system of government we're in. Like, if we don't switch to a communist system or a socialist system, I guess I'll just be sad forever, and I'll be poor as well. So the liberal shadow here is that greater systemic problems that are happening, they do affect people in negative ways, but not to the point where you can relinquish your personal responsibility. They're not acting on you. And this is something liberals really don't know this because they haven't experienced it. Those systemic systems do not control you. They don't. I mean, just, if you're struggling with this, I would say, start to look up examples of actual people who've gone from rags to riches, or, they used to be in prison for selling weed or something, and now they're a $1 million startup founder or something. Like, there are plenty of examples of how that's just not the ultimate truth. And even if you were struggling, in theory, because of some unfair system, there's never going to be a point in reality, in this life, where there isn't an action you can take there's usually like billions of actions you can take every single day to change where you're at, to change where you're feeling, to change everything about your life, essentially. So the blind spot of the liberal is codependence. I can't feel good until you change. Other people need to change to make me feel better. And, you know, I do understand there are people who would say, I am a horrible person for saying that, and that's not a shadow, that's actually just truth. Like, they really think that is the full truth. And I understand that because it is, you know, a lot of unethical things happen constantly. So it's very easy to take that. But what they do is they take that and they use that as a scapegoat. They say, this is the reason I'm having problems. So they're scapegoating things. Just like we were saying about the conservative upbringing, how they didn't get, you know, the vulnerability is good, your emotions are okay. Like, they didn't get that therapeutic environment. The liberals didn't get that empowering environment. So remembering, liberals skew young, right? Now, when we look, what kind of parenting strategies, what kind of upbringing happened when millennials were being raised in their younger years? The parenting strategy was, and psychologists love to complain about this all the time, people were too coddled, right? You always hear about especially like older psychologists, like they're like they what do they call it, the trophy culture or something? Everybody gets a trophy. I roll my eyes a little bit at this because it's like they think that like congratulating people is the problem, or like, oh, don't give them too much praise, then they might, you know, feel too good about themselves. It's not that. It's not that you can praise someone too much or make someone have too high self-esteem. There's no such thing as too high self-esteem. What happened to these people, often liberals and millennials, and again, I'm going to do another video on this baby boomer millennial thing, but what happened is they didn't get taught, they were taught to be codependent. They were taught that they really are victims that need to be saved. So in the liberal shadow, for this reason, it's often empowerment is in their shadow. You know, like taking control of their life is in their shadow. Not blaming other people for your problems is in their shadow. Recognizing their ability to take action and create change, not societally, not systemically, but individually in their actual concrete life. So my finances, my personal relationships, my, you know, everything immediate, all this stuff the conservatives like to talk about, the immediate type, you know, the immediate family, immediate circle, friends, spouses, like not the wider community, right? That's the liberal shadow, impacting change there. And because they feel sort of like, you know, disempowered there, and they tend to be very, very like mental, like college educated, like conceptual thinkers, their effort automatically goes to, how can we change the community? How can we change things externally? And this, I'm not going to say this is a bad thing, because certainly I'm sure many people came from that background and did go on to like invent a new, you know, create a nonprofit that like changed the world or something. Totally, that can happen. But what I'm actually seeing a lot of these types of liberals experiencing is disempowerment in the practical sense. And they think it's because of a wider systemic problem, institutions, government, culture. It's actually not. It's because of their codependence issues. And that's something conservatives love to point out, but conservatives are horribly mean because they haven't dealt with any of their own baggage. So they'll just shame the liberals instead of actually, you know, liberals are all about like the therapeutic environment, you know, and conservatives are like, no, you can't have that because I didn't have that. So long story short, liberals who have a lot of emotional issues, they never tend to get the help that they need because it's so hard to empower someone. Like, conservatives are all about tough love. They tend to be, often, not all, but they tend to be all about tough love, and liberals don't respond to that. That causes shame. That brings up the inadequacy that they already feel, the guilt, the shame, there's something wrong with me, I'm defective, why can't I live an empowered life, get anything done. This is a lot of the storyline of the millennial, and again, we're going to do a whole other video on that, but this is loosely what I believe to be going on in the shadow of the conservative, the shadow of the liberal. And if they each want to get better, they have to do what the opposite side is doing. They have to start learning from the opposite side. And that's why both of them never learn anything and never change, because they won't do that. So I know that was a lot to take in. I hope this video made sense to you. I hope if you are very political, you're not extremely offended. And feel free to subscribe if you like this kind of content. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, my newsletter, and that's it. I will see you next time.